Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about a man who wakes in a field and the night that finally answered back. There is something about the flatlands that makes you feel very small, not in a frightening way, in a clarifying way. The sky out here goes on forever. A gray-blue dome in winter, a burning amber bowl in summer. And beneath it, the land just continues. Wheat fields that stretch to the edge of sight. Fence lines that seem to vanish before they end. The occasional stand of poplar, dark and thin against the horizon, like punctuation in a language you almost understand. This is the flatlands of Manitoba. And this is where Nikolai has lived for most of his 51 years. He knows this land the way you know the back of your own hand. Every dip in the road, every loose board in the barn, the exact sound the farmhouse makes when the wind comes in from the north. A low, resonant moan through the eaves, like the house is settling into itself, like it is preparing for something. He never used to think much about that sound. He does now. It started in March. Or at least, that is when he first noticed. He woke up one morning with mud on his feet. Not the damp clay of the yard, which he might have explained away. A late-night walk to the outhouse. A moment of fresh air before bed. This was field mud. Dark and heavy, with the particular smell of turned earth and winter melt. The kind that only comes from the crop rows half a kilometer from the house. The kind that clings. He stood in his kitchen that morning in bare feet, looking down at the dark smears on the linoleum, and felt something cold move through him. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling of reaching for something in the dark, and touching it, before you expected to. He cleaned his feet. He drank his coffee. He told himself he must have walked in his sleep. He told himself it was a one-time thing. It was not a one-time thing. By April, it had happened 11 more times. He knew because he had started keeping a small notebook on the kitchen counter. A spiral-bound thing he used for farm accounts. Its pages smelling of grain dust and diesel. Each morning, he would check his feet. If there was mud, he wrote the date. If there wasn't, he wrote nothing. The entries came every 2 or 3 nights, sometimes more. His wife, Marta, had passed 4 years before, and there was no one else in the house. No one to tell him. No one to hear him leave. The dog, a border collie named Hector who slept by the stove, would not look at him. On the mornings after, Hector would lie with his head on his paws, watching Nikolai from across the room with those careful, amber eyes, tracking him without lifting his head, as if waiting to see what Nikolai would do next, as if he already knew something Nikolai didn't. The field in question was the North Field. He had grown wheat in it for 20 years. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was rectangular, about 4 hectares, bordered on the north side by a shallow drainage ditch and a rusted wire fence. Beyond the fence, more farmland. Beyond that, more sky. He walked out to it one afternoon, in full daylight, to see if there was anything to see. There wasn't. Just the flat, damp earth, still patchy with the last of the winter frost. A few old tractor ruts softened by the melt. The fence. The sky. He stood there for a while with his hands in his pockets, the wind pulling at his collar, and felt faintly foolish. He was a practical man. He had grown up practical. His father had been a farmer before him, and his father's father before that. And practicality was the inheritance of people who live close to the land, an understanding that nature is large and indifferent, that hard work is the only answer, and that there is no use in dwelling on the things you can't explain. He went back inside and installed the camera. It was a simple thing. A small black box on a shelf in the kitchen, pointed at the back door. He had used it once before to catch a raccoon that kept getting into the grain shed. Motion activated. Timestamps. A small, blinking, red light that meant it was recording. He went to bed that night with the light still blinking. He woke up the next morning to mud on his feet. The footage was 23 minutes long. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold beside him and watched himself on the small screen of his phone. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. He watched himself come down the stairs. He was barefoot, dressed in the gray long-sleeve shirt and flannel pants he slept in. His eyes were open. That was the first thing. His eyes were fully open. Not the half-lidded blur of someone half asleep, but open and focused and looking straight ahead, as if he knew exactly where he was going and had no uncertainty about it at all. He walked to the back door. He didn't reach for the light. He didn't pause. He opened the door and went out into the dark without hesitating, without looking back, without any of the small, cautious movements of a person navigating an unlit house. He moved like someone who could see perfectly well in the dark. He had installed a second camera above the back door, pointing out across the yard. He watched himself cross the yard in the grainy night vision green of the footage. A pale figure, upright, arms at his sides, moving at a steady, unhurried pace toward the north field. Hector was visible in the lower corner of the frame, sitting on the porch step, watching, not following, just watching. The second camera couldn't reach the field itself, but he had put a third one on the fence post, just to be thorough. The third camera showed him arriving at the field at 2:19 a.m. He watched himself stop at a specific point, not the edge of the field, but inside it, about 10 meters from the fence, in a spot that looked identical to every other spot. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, arms at his sides, face tilted very slightly upward, looking north, looking at the sky, or at something he believed to be in the sky, or at nothing at all. He stood like that for exactly 40 minutes. Nikolai watched the footage 3 times. He watched himself stand completely still in a dark field at 2 a.m. for 40 minutes. His coat was not on. The temperature that night had been 4 degrees above zero. He should have been shaking. He should have been rigid with cold. But on the footage, he simply stood, as still as the fence posts around him, as still as the dark. At 2:59 a.m., he turned and walked home. He did not look around. He did not seem to wake from anything. He simply turned, with the same calm certainty with which he had arrived, and walked back across the yard and into the house. He watched himself close the back door. He watched himself climb the stairs and disappear. The recording ended. He sat with his cold coffee for a long time. The thing that troubled him most was not the walking. It was not the cold, or the dark, or the bare feet. It was the stillness in the field, because he had watched himself stand in that spot for 40 minutes. 40 minutes, in a field, at 2 in the morning. And his body language was not the posture of a sleeping man. It was not the slack, uncertain posture of a person lost in a dream, adrift and unmoored. It was the posture of a person listening. In June, when the wheat had grown knee-high, he went out to the north field in the afternoon and walked to the spot. He knew the spot now. He had watched the footage enough times to mark it in his memory. The way it sat in relation to the fence, the slight depression in the earth to its left, the old gray post that leaned a few degrees east. He found it without difficulty. He stood in it. He placed his feet where he placed them in the footage. The wheat moved around him, in the wind, a long, slow wave rolling south, like something breathing. The sky above him was enormous and pale blue and absolutely clear. A hawk turned in a lazy circle far to the east. Somewhere beyond the fence, a tractor was working. The distant diesel hum, carrying across the flat land, with the peculiar clarity that open spaces give to sound. He stood there and felt nothing unusual. He looked down at his feet. The earth at the spot was darker than the surrounding soil. He noticed this now that he was standing in it. A rough circle, perhaps a meter across, where the soil was a shade deeper, as if it had been wet more recently, or as if something had pressed the air out of it. The wheat grew through it normally. There was no burn, no bare patch, no sign of anything chemical or deliberate. Just darker earth. Just a circle. He crouched down and put his hand flat against the ground. The soil was warm, not sun warm. The June sun had not yet reached the angle to warm this patch more than the rest. It was warm from below, faintly, steadily, the way a stone holds heat long after the fire has gone. He took his hand away. He looked at his palm. He stood up. He walked back to the house. He did not run. He was a practical man. He walked at his normal pace, with his hands at his sides, the way he always walked. But he did not look back at the field. And he did not look back at the spot. And later, that evening, when Hector came to sit beside him by the stove and leaned against his leg, Nikolai put his hand on the dog's back and sat there a long time without speaking, without moving, just feeling the warmth of the animal and the low creak of the house and the wind outside coming in from the north. That night, he did not fall asleep for a long time. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. The wind in the eaves, the faint creak of the floorboards settling, the distant sound of nothing, which is its own kind of sound out here, the sound of absence that is so total it becomes a presence. He thought about the spot. He thought about the warmth of the soil under his hand. He thought about Marta, who had loved this land with a quietness that he had always found steadying. She used to walk the fields in the evening, just before dark, when the light went gold and horizontal, and made everything look ancient. He would watch her from the porch sometimes, a small figure moving slowly through the wheat, her hands trailing at her sides, touching the heads of grain as she passed. She said it helped her think. She said the land listened. He had never known what she meant by that. He closed his eyes. He did not mean to sleep. He was trying not to sleep. But somewhere between one breath and the next, the house sounds grew softer, and the darkness behind his eyes deepened. and his thoughts began to drift without direction, the way thoughts do just before they dissolve entirely. And in that in-between space, not asleep, not awake, he heard something, not with his ears, or not only with his ears. He heard it the way you hear a sound in a dream, fully and completely, as if it has always been there, and you have simply not been quiet enough to notice it until now. It was his name, or not his name exactly. It was something beneath his name, the shape of him, the particular frequency of who he was, called from somewhere below the field, below the frost line, below the patient dark of the winter earth. It was not frightening. It was not urgent. It was patient. It was the patience of something that has waited for a very long time and has learned not to rush. He opened his eyes. He was standing in the field. The stars above him were extraordinary. This far from any town, with nothing between him and the sky, the night was full of them. Thick and cold and ancient, burning in the black above the flat horizon. The wheat around him reached his waist now, and in the darkness it was silver and soft, and the wind moved it slowly, and it made the sound that wheat always makes in the dark, which is something between a whisper and a breath. He was in the spot. He knew because he could feel it, the faint warmth through the soles of his bare feet, the particular quality of the silence here, which was different from the silence everywhere else, denser somehow, more attentive. He looked up at the stars. He stood there, and he let himself stand there, and something in him that had been tightly held for 4 years, since the room with the yellow light, since the hand in his, since the particular sound a house makes when it becomes just a house and no longer a home. Something in him, quietly, without drama, let go. He was not afraid. He did not understand what was happening. He was not certain he was meant to understand. Some things are larger than understanding. Some things ask only to be stood in, like a field at night, like a sky full of stars, like grief, vast and patient and ongoing. And somehow, when you stop fighting it, almost like company. He stood for 40 minutes. He did not count them. He did not need to. When it was time, he turned and walked home. In the morning, there was mud on his feet. He looked at it for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the north field, flat and green and ordinary in the early light, the wheat swaying gently in the first breath of the day. He did not write in the notebook. He put the kettle on. Hector came to stand beside him, leaning against his leg, and Nikolai put his hand on the dog's back. Outside, the sky was enormous and pale and still, and the land went on in every direction. And somewhere in the north field, in a circle of warm earth, no larger than a kitchen table, the wheat grew just like everywhere else. Just like everywhere else. Almost. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the loneliest fields have something to say. If this stillness stayed with you, if the warmth of that dark earth settled somewhere deep, then let it remain a little while longer. Some places call to us not out of darkness, but out of something older and quieter than darkness. Rest now. The field will keep its secrets until you're ready.